Angie and Josh, welcome to World Building Secrets.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm so happy you guys are here. This is gonna be fun. Yeah. So as you may or may not know, I usually like to start with a question that requires a little bit of thinking. And I'm gonna ask one question to Angie and one to you, Josh. So Josh, what's a book or comic or any kind of piece of writing that you wish was turned into a movie? And Angie, what's a book or a comic or any other piece of writing that you wish was or hasn't been or should not have been turned into a movie?
Oh man, I'll kind of like twist that a little bit. My favorite, one of my favorite series that is by Joseph Delaney. He just passed away. It's a YA kind of dark fantasy series. And they did well, no, I'm answering Angie's question. Sorry. Angie, you go first. I got to think about it.
All right. Well, I'll say Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, which is a novel that just blew me away. I absolutely loved that book, which is about a comic book, surprisingly enough. I don't know if you've read it, but it's fantastic. It's post-apocalyptic, kind of relevant for today. And last year they released, I think it was either on HBO or Apple Plus. I can't remember, but it was like a, 8-episode series, and it was very disappointing. I actually subscribed to whatever service that was just for that show.
Oh,
and
no.
It was very sad.
That's the worst. When you have to go
and I think, they did a nice job with it. If I can step back from my emotions that are all wrapped up in the novel and recognize that, it was a good story, but it wasn't the same story.
It wasn't the same story.
Yeah.
Okay. What about you, Josh?
God, I'm like struggling to think of something that should be turned into a movie. I'm just going to go with like Denver Moon by Warren Hammond and Josh Viola, just because I'm lazy and that's a cop out. There's like, I think that's like a challenge, right? To figure out, because so much stuff's being turned into anything that has like any sort of following has already been optioned, right?
Yeah.
So I'm like super lame and can't think of anything.
It's definitely, I think, a big question of like, what kind of art is meant to exist in its specific context that it was made to be in, and how can you adapt it and changing that. Right. I think that's what like the Unioverse is doing, and I think the story is doing really well, is it's created in a way where it can be adapted into so many different things, which we'll get into. But okay, so you guys are one of two of our writers. I think probably one of our most important writers. And I was wondering if you guys can give us a little bit of insight on how you guys started working together, because I know you guys have quite the history.
Yeah. So my husband, Warren Hammond, is Josh's co-author on the Denver Moon series, as he just mentioned. And so I think the first time that we met Josh was through Dean, probably through some mutual friends. Yep. I kind of remember meeting you at a book event at Broadway Book Mall.
Oh yeah.
And you and Aaron were there, and you were just talking about starting Hex at that point. So, and then, I was also familiar with Aaron's artwork, and Aaron was like, he blows everybody away with his talent. And so then Josh is just one of those masters of kind of bringing people into his fold. So he'll come up with an idea, and then he'll be like, who can I collaborate? He's very collaborative. Who can I collaborate with on this? And then he'll just ask, hey, come work with me on this. Let's do this. Can I hire you to do this? So we ended up doing a comic book together back in 2016, probably.
Okay.
Somewhere around there. Yeah.
Tooth and Claw. So that was the first time that I had worked with Josh and Aaron directly on this project. And I think it went really well. And I'm really proud of what, of Josh's vision, and that he made space for me in that vision. So yeah, then we were always kind of talking about doing an anthology together. And then this came up, and Josh was like, hey, you're doing this with me.
And now she doesn't answer my texts or my phone calls or my emails. No, I'm kidding. We text like every day, all the time. Yeah. That's pretty much like she said. I when I started Hex Publishers, the focus was primarily anthologies, and it still really is. Obviously, we're doing an anthology for Unio, right?
Yep.
And my co-founder, Dean Wyatt, who Angie mentioned, introduced me to a number of not just local writers, but writers with like a solid reputation. And Angie's husband, Warren, was on the list, and I got a copy of his book, Cop, K-O-P. And it's like this super awesome. We'll talk about a book that needs to be turned into a movie, actually.
Yeah.
It should be the Cop series.
Yeah.
Warren is an extremely talented writer, and he's in our he's one of the authors contributing to our anthology. But I pestered the hell out of him to try to rope him into a horror anthology that we did, and then that's really when I got to know both Warren and Angie, and then they invited me into their writers critique group, which had some other writers in the group that are contributing. So Gene C. Stein, Mario Acevedo were also there. So
is that where you guys
this,
really?
Well, it's just we've got this cool little circle that we all collaborate, we all respect each other's work and friendships.
That's awesome. I think that kind of a space is really important. Do you think that's where you guys really got to know each other's approaches to writing and what kind of skill sets you do have and how to find the balance when it comes to working together?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you're seeing like everybody from like a raw, from an artistic standpoint, you're seeing crap essentially, right? I shouldn't say crap, but like you're seeing like with my stuff, it's crap,
unfinished work,
and I need like Warren and Angie to and Mario and Gene, to provide that feedback and help shape something. And for me, it was a great learning experience, and I got to see, as somebody who likes to put projects together and works as an editor, everybody's strengths. So, and it just so happened that, that's when I started to see what Angie was capable of, because she's just as, strong a writer as Warren and anybody, she's very, very good. Almost all of the anthologies I've invited her to, she hasn't been in all of them because we didn't know each other at the start, but I mean, hers tend to be my favorite stories in the books.
Oh, thank you.
And that's even against like Stephen and Warren. No, but you get to see like how everybody, what their strengths are, and Angie's got a really good voice and a really solid eye, for story structure.
Yeah, Angie, tell us a little bit about your approach to writing, and then maybe Josh, you can tell us a little bit about yours, so we can see kind of how you guys really do work together.
I think I want to just let Josh keep talking about me. Actually, that was awesome.
Super flattering.
Thank you.
Oh, I was talking about another Angie. I just realized.
Oh, yeah. All right. That makes sense. So I I'd always kind of wanted to be a writer when I was a kid, and, read a bunch, and ended up getting 2 English degrees, and thought about sticking around to do a third. One of my advisors in grad school was like, hey, you should stick around for another 3 years and do an MFA. And I was like, okay. And then they cut the funding for the assistantship that I was being offered. And so I decided to go to the Publishing Institute at the University of Denver instead, and kind of go more the business route. So I graduated from the Publishing Institute. It's been 20 years now, 2002. And so ever since then, with a couple of breaks, I have worked in writing and publishing. So mostly nonfiction. So I worked in the magazine industry for a long time. I worked in educational publishing and curriculum design. And then eventually Kristen Nelson, who owns Nelson Literary Agency, she's the founder here in Denver. She and I met at the Publishing Institute. She was a student there as well. So she started her agency right after that. And then she's like, hey, you should come work for me. And I said, well, as soon as you can afford me, let me know. So she hired me 10 years later in 20. No, actually, it wasn't quite that. Let's see. I think it was 2011 that I started working there. And I actually started doing contracts and royalty statements, very analytically minded. So I was more on the numbers and number side of thing. And then she started recognizing that I had an editorial eye. And so from then on, I've been doing manuscript editing. I read a lot of slush. I request manuscripts. I read query letters. And then for our existing clients, I'll assist our agents in getting manuscripts ready to go out on submission to publishers. So awesome. Yeah, I write kind of when the opportunity presents itself. But I wouldn't say that it's my number one goal in life anymore, like it was when I was younger. It's hard, working in the industry and seeing the sausage get made.
Yeah, for sure.
To want to spend your free time doing it as well. So I still enjoy doing it. I do it when I can, but yeah.
Do you usually find yourself wanting to write out of like a spark of inspiration, or if it's an exciting project?
Probably both. I think what's so great about working with Hex is that Josh comes up with these like phenomenal ideas that foster that inspiration. So he'll put out there, like, here's a theme for an anthology I want to do. And all of a sudden I'm, just like popping off ideas. And so I like having that direction, right. That feels a little bit more like there's a safety net when you jump. So somebody gives me the theme and then I can kind of play within that arena.
Awesome. Is it definitely geared more towards sci-fi, or do you like to kind of play around with genres? That's also a question for you, Josh.
Yeah, I like every story idea I come up with ends up having some kind of sci-fi, fantastical, supernatural bent to it.
Yeah, same here. I mean, Hex, like in our mission statement on the website, it's about genre fiction, right? So that encompasses horror, science fiction, fantasy, all of that. And I think about this a lot. It's like when Halloween, because I love Halloween. It's my favorite holiday. Yeah. Got married on Halloween. So did Angie and Warren.
Yeah.
Oh, I love Halloween.
We go to, haunted houses now. That's a tradition that we all started. But, like I get really into it. Right. And then I'm like, just like everybody, it's not like uncommon. You start watching horror movies like the whole month of October. And then I'll have this like moment where I'm like, do I like horror or science fiction more? Cause like when it's October, it's like, it's all, sci-fi is out the window, but yeah, I don't know. It's more about like, I love high concept ideas, and that's what really sparks concepts for me. That's where I start. Angie and I have had this conversation. She really like illuminated something for me, made me realize when I was, I often like send stuff for her to edit, to get her opinion on for like back cover copy and synopsis for products that I'm putting out. Yep. And she sent back, she's like, you focus on world building like first, not and character second. And Angie's different. She's character first and
interesting.
Building, third or fourth. And she's like, I think that's because you come from a video game background, because I worked in video games and love video games. And I was like, that's interesting. That's like, I don't know if that's a compliment or criticism, but it works great because when you and I work together, I think we have that focus on both sides, where there's a lot of attention put on each thing. I'd like to think I make good, strong characters, but apparently
I think it's fair to say that you do. But speaking of world building, so let's talk a little bit about how you guys got involved with the Unioverse, and I want to kind of pick your brains a little bit about the origin story in particular, and Malcolm and Ryan, and how even this concept came to life. Because I think not only I mentioned that it's so specifically tailored to really be, remain open, but at the same time be so detailed and inspiring that people are compelled to write and, fall in love with the Unioverse and become devoted to it. How does this concept of Malcolm and Ryan and taking that risk, going to Mars, discovering creator tech, how did that even come to life? Where did this idea come from?
Well, when I was roped into the project, so I know Wyeth personally. He doesn't live far from here. We've worked together in the past on numerous projects, and he's been bugging me about marrying the Hex and something that he's been doing. And when I saw, when he told me about what Unioverse is and who is involved, it's like, oh my God, Tony Harmon and Brent Friedman were really what he dangled in front of me. And it's like, yes, let's do it. And then when conversation started, I was like, oh, well, I know that I have this friend that's a great writer. We've been talking about doing an anthology. So and that was Angie, obviously. So Angie came on board, but Brent already had this template laid out, that he'd been developing, obviously with Wyeth, what the Unioverse is. Now it was very, it was like, as we've said many times, it's like wet cement, right? But the foundation was there. Mm-hmm. And he had a conversation with me, I think before Angie came on, and he was just kind of talking, filling me in on what the Unioverse is. And he made this like really random off-key comment about a brave traveler. And I was like, who's the brave traveler? What's that? And he goes, oh, I just, I don't know. He made it up on the spot. And I was like, that like, to me, that's interesting. Like, who is that? What is that? So I started working on the first story, my story for the anthology. And it was when the rules were really, really slippery and undefined. Mm-hmm. And it was like a 15,000 word short story I wrote with a friend, Sean Eads. And we took the concept of the brave traveler and turned that into Mason Orion, who is now Malcolm Orion. And then his, descendant from 500 years ago, 500 years later, which is now in the Unioverse, Nova Orion. And so we started like presenting these ideas, and that was great. Angie was editing and providing feedback on the story front. Brent and Wyeth were looking at it and tearing it apart for the sake of rules. And that's when we realized, oh, okay, we need to, there's a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense yet. And it was at that point we worked as a team to really sort of focus on the world building, right. story world. And that's when Andy was hired, was to help assist with that. So anyhow, that's my take on how it the origin started with the story.
I like that. Angie, maybe you can give us a little bit of insight. I think, Josh, you mentioned, rules and guidelines. And I think a world like ours, in order to have, to be a franchise and to be so open to the community, it needs to have those rules and guidelines and those and specific characters and worlds to then be developed into anthologies and comics and hopefully movies in the future, books, who knows. How do you translate those rules across different kinds of contexts and medias?
Yeah. It's a lot of trial and error.
It's a loaded question.
Yeah. No, it's been an interesting project for me, coming from a background of just working one-on-one with an author. Mm-hmm. And my job as an editor is trying to understand their vision and trying to make it work. What they're doing, trying to, for lack of a better word, make it marketable, right? Make a publisher mm-hmm. want to buy it. So it's a much more intimate back and forth. This is very team-based. And so with the world being built kind of under our feet, every time we take a step forward, we have to trust that there's going to be more world for us to work with. So we had a couple of false starts. It's like, okay, well, let's develop some pitches for our story ideas, because that's one of the things that we asked the anthology editors to do. And then we could go through those pitches and read them and be like, okay, the story is there. We have an arc, all the story basics are in place. Here's where the world, you might be violating a rule, or you might be tiptoeing up to something that the story team kind of wants to stay away from for a while. We want that to be a reveal later on. So we don't want to dive into that quite yet. So then we could go back to the author and kind of encourage them to rethink this story. And of course, then that changes the arcs, and all the fundamentals can shift at that point too. Mm-hmm. So we were doing a lot of kind of on the spot development. So for me, that was really fun, becoming part of this team, having the input, but also just absorbing and kind of mm-hmm. recognizing that there are so many, the landscape of working on a project like this is so different from what I'm used to. So I kind of feel sometimes like I'm a little mouse in the corner. Like, just tell me what you want. Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. Yeah.
It's challenging.
It's been really cool though.
I mean, I think it's so different. I think, being in this kind of moment where a franchise is being built. And I think in many ways, franchises are the future. I don't know if do you guys agree, disagree?
I mean, certainly that's how it looks now. I don't, I hope it comes from franchises are cool, but let's not like make it all superhero franchises. I shouldn't say that. I'll get.
I agree.
Yeah.
Totally.
We need original stuff like this. So.
We do. I think the most unique part about this is that it's community owned. And, we're shaping and we're still yet to, we still have yet to reveal a lot of the story for people to really find out what the Unioverse story is and then go off and write their own. But so I think the closest we're going to get soon is with comics. And I was wondering if you can tell me a little bit, first of all, can you tell us a little bit about the comics themselves? Because there's a couple issues. They're split differently. There's some new characters. Let's go with that. If you can give us a short summary, because I know we can't probably talk about it too much.
Yeah, I'll start and Angie can take it from there. We were tasked with introducing the 5 first heroes. Everybody knows who Ryu and Krisha are. But there are 3 more that I don't think have been teased yet. So we're sort of trying to establish their character, their backstory, their Ryu. His name's changed so much, so I jump between it. But Ryu and Krisha have this like backstory that kind of intertwines. So you'll see that between the first 2 comics. Mm-hmm. But then when we dive into the other characters, we're showing them from their worlds, and we were really focused on the expanse of this universe and all of the different worlds and all of the different species and where they come from and how to tie them together, right? So we're really focusing on giving some diversity there, and then the real fun part. I mean, the whole thing's been fun, but was that Angie and I were tasked with creating the first villain that will appear in the Unioverse and how it all connects to these 5 heroes. So yeah, the first 5 comics are really introducing them, and the 6th one, which is like a double issue, it's longer, will show how they all connect and introduce the villain. So
yeah, I think for the comic books, especially because there's going to be, each comic book has to have kind of its own arc, kind of end on a cliffhanger, but then the series these first 6 also have an arc. So we did a lot of outlining and a lot of brainstorming. Josh and I think I sent you some of the notes, like some of our scribbles in my notebook that I still have of, who are these characters? We were given character sketches from Brent, and, we were able to kind of work with that, who these characters were, what drives them, what are their abilities, and then start to think about what story could we give that character to highlight that so that the reader feels introduced and connected to that character. So we started doing kind of a grid, like every single page of the comic book, we're doing a page by page outline for each book. And then that was, of course, worked on by the team, kind of a lot of back and forth there. And then we go into scripting. And I think the first script that I put together was very, page by page. And and now it feels, now that we're kind of getting into a rhythm and we kind of understand how, Josh is working with Ben, the artist, and the process feels a little more fluid now. So I feel like I can be less formal because I know Josh and Ben are going to make the script work on the art side. And so it's smoother now than the first couple.
I think the real challenge was, we were trying to figure out before we knew what the stories were in the comics, right? It's like on the business model for what the comics are, what they represent, how soon we can put them together,
Yeah.
And so the first 5 are, they're short, they're fast, but they're That doesn't mean that they're, the story's strong, the characters are, on the page, we get right to it. But we sort of modeled them after, or took inspiration from the Overwatch anthology comic series, which was the same sort of thing, where it was like throwing out these characters and very, introducing them in very quick formats. And that, I think that was the most challenging part, was, having such a limited page spread, right, to tell these stories and really let the reader know who these characters are. But I think we accomplished it. I'm really proud of, I think the comics are awesome, and the way they all tie together, it's just going to be sweet. I can't wait for people to see it.
I can't wait. Can you give us a little bit of a hint of like when we could potentially expect them to come?
Well, Wyeth might kill me, but I think that I'll just say loosely Q1 next year, which is great, because originally we were thinking summer. So we're moving it forward. It sounds like a little bit for at least the first issue.
I know that people are really excited, and I saw a question in our Discord that was, how do you find when you guys, so you're writers, how do you find the right artists to work with? For example, Ben Matsuya is our artist, right? That's doing all the comic book art.
Yeah, so I vetted Ben. I found him. He's out of California, and he's just phenomenal, because he's like one-stop shop, and he's really talented at everything he does. Typically in the comic book world, at least traditionally, it's like you're finding, somebody who's going to do the pencils, the inks, the colors, the letters, and Ben does them all, and really, really well. Like, it's not like, at every level, I've been just amazed by how beautiful the artwork is, and how quickly he turns it around, so he's just great. And he's awesome to work with. He's a really cool guy, very collaborative, and he takes the words that Angie and I have put together, and it's that next step, right? It's that evolution. And that's been the fun back and forth to see the, like how he interpreted something. It's like, whoa, that's cool. So we go back and forth, but Ben's great. I have a background, in art. I was the art director for Leviathan Games with Wyeth. So I have a background there. I was an artist. My husband, Aaron, is one of the concept artists. He did the cover for the anthology, for the Unio anthology. And he developed a number of the characters in the concept art stage that are making an appearance. So, Wyeth tasked me with finding the right artist for this. And AJ Nazaro is doing the cover art, and he's an artist for Blizzard, works on Hearthstone. I think he's contributed to Overwatch. He's also another Colorado guy and a friend of mine. So we've got just this really cool hub here.
I like the family. I think it's unique to work with so many people that have so much history, because it's such a fun. It's just a way more fun environment than I think any other company, to be honest.
But Angie's made some good points about with Tooth and Claw, our comic that we originally did together. That was a little different because it was so close knit. It was me, you, and Aaron, right? So now this, you've never met Ben before he was turning, what we were writing into art. But anyhow, you've talked about it in an interesting way.
Yeah. I wish I remember what I said.
It's always like that.
Well, it's nice that, Josh is like the perfect bridge between narrative and art when it comes to comics. He's a phenomenal editor. Not only when it comes to tightening up the story, thinking about what a character would do in a particular moment, like, let's tweak this, but also just in tightening up, a line of dialogue here and there, and really shaping, I feel like I can just kind of hand him this lump of clay and he's going to shape it. But then he has the narrative and the story sense, and then he can turn that around into the art sense and communicate that to Ben. So Josh really he's the rainbow.
Jack of all trades.
Connects the two sides.
That's awesome.
It could be interpreted so many different ways, but
I thought before I said it, and then I went ahead with it anyway.
That's fine. That's fine.
We've seen, our community has seen the most of Ryu We've seen him a lot. We've seen him from various different angles. We don't really know much about him yet. So I was wondering if you guys could give us a little bit of a, maybe a little like synopsis, but also your own personal, I think maybe like thoughts and predictions of Ryu in the Unioverse and who he stands for, what he stands for, sorry, and what are his values.
I think he's a really good character to begin with, to kind of introduce the world with. He is stuck in a transpod for, since the Great Fracture. And so he has that longevity. He was around before the Great Fracture. He's around now, but he doesn't remember. So we've got that impetus to figure out, he wants to figure out who he was, who his people are, where his reputation came from as this Reaper. Ryu the Reaper is his nickname. There are these hieroglyphics that kind of hint at who he was and who his people were and what he was capable of. So he's kind of a bit of a blank slate as far as kind of recreating himself in the present while thinking about his past. And again, the fact that he was present for that, I think, opens up a lot of future storytelling possibilities as right. He perhaps becomes, recovers his memories, or maybe he doesn't, so we can play with him a lot as this moves forward, I think. And
he's just the most badass visual looking character, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. He's really interesting. But I think all of them, I think that the story team, did a good job balancing these 5 characters.
Yeah.
Because they're all, I don't really have a favorite.
I was literally going to ask you. I can tell you, do you have a favorite?
For me, I don't know. I like elements about each of their stories and their personalities. Mm-hmm. I don't know. What do you think, Angie?
Right now I'm kind of liking Tor Gret. And I think that's probably because Wyeth originally envisioned Tor as Raylan Givens from Justified, and Justified is, one of my favorite shows. That character is amazing. So as soon as I saw that connection, I'm like, okay, yeah, I feel this character. He's going to be fun to write. And the fact that he comes from this royalty, this privileged background that he's turned his back on in the name of doing good is, but is willing to tip over into the morally gray to get things done, I think makes him a really cool character.
Yeah.
He's I don't awesome. Know. Vela Jenks is cool too, because he's the anti-hero. I think he's got the more, for me, he's the fun one to watch. How he processes all of the other heroes, and he's kind of an asshole, but an asshole you like.
I'm so excited to read them. I really am. I'm also really curious about Krisha, because she seems like such a mysterious, like she has I feel like a lot of qualities that Ryu has in terms of like badassness, the confidence, but I don't know, is it just me, or is there some sort of like sensitive, almost like very something that triggers her or could trigger her very easily? I don't know if that's it's something I just picked up on, but I'm curious if I'm on the right track.
She's an interesting character because she's been blinded by indoctrination in a lot of ways, and she will come to terms with what her past really means. And she's one of the characters. I guess they've all had a rough go at it. Coming up, but she has she's like an orphan. She lost her parents. She's got this like badass facade, right? But I definitely think she's, we have this sequence where she's walking through, the inner rings, which is like the lower area, kind of the slums of the hub.
Yep.
And she sees some orphan kids, and she's like recalling her past. And I think we touched on that.
I'm sure our community will be really curious to know how you start writing a comic. Where do you start? Maybe that's the better question.
I think you start by reading a lot of comics. which, and Josh mentioned, that we really started to get our heads in the right space by looking at the Overwatch comics and kind of looking at the pacing, looking at the character development. And again, for me, I haven't been in this world. So I always have to look at examples when I have any new project. And so I'm like, okay, I'm getting in the headspace. So I'd say step one, get in the headspace. Step two, I'm a very pen on paper kind of person versus necessarily, getting on the computer and starting to type it in a document. So I, sketch, draw diagrams, write notes in the margins and kind of start making connections on paper. I think that brainstorming level is kind of how I start.
It's interesting. Angie always says this, she's not from this world, in the sense that she doesn't consume the comic books but I think that that's such a benefit. I think that's why we work well together, because you have such a strong storytelling sense, but you have this perspective that's, I'm looking at it from that like nerdy, like consumer point of view. And I know what I believe I know what works and what they want. Right. But then you're like, well, that doesn't make sense. So here's my point. And now we'll keep that, but we have to work our way through to get to it. So I think it's going to benefit the readers in a lot of ways. This, like the way our collaborative nature comes together. I think it's, that's why I'm so excited about these stories. I think they're really strong, but, cool. Going back to that, on how we like conceptualize this stuff, again, we have a kind of a rough template of who these characters, at least the first 5 characters were. But for me, it was like, okay, well, Brent and Wyeth really defined who those guys are. Again, we helped shape them and mold them, but we know, what we're working with to some extent. But I was like, I want to create the Darth Vader of this series. Like, so how that was my focus when we started on this. It's like, before we even start outlining the comics, let's figure out who the villain is, what his role is in this world, and how that affects these other characters. So that was like, I was just throwing really high concept, crazy ideas at Angie, and I was like happy because like one of my first ideas, you were like, oh, that's cool. And so we took that and went back and forth quite a bit until we felt comfortable enough to share it with Brent and Andy. Right. And then define that character more. And then it was like, okay, so now we know who this dude is, what his role is in this universe. And once we figured out that backstory, that's when we started outlining and roping in the other characters. So that's how I perceive it, at least, that's how this process started. And then, then of course it was the grid, the outline and the many back and forths,
for sure,
to get it right.
Have you ever found yourselves in your careers where you had to maybe remove yourselves from a situation because that just wasn't an environment where you wanted to work in?
I have worked with, I can think of one author in particular who was very not excited about the revision letter that I had provided and was pretty upset about it. I kind of, in the work that I do with novelists, there is a lot of ego.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's just the nature of the game. When you are the sole creative mind and force behind a story, and then you have to submit to some degree to the input of an editor, of an agent, of the acquiring editor. There's such a process that goes into bringing a novel to market, and a lot of, we have this love in the West, I think, with this idea of the lone creative genius, where if you allow anybody else to come into your idea, then it's no longer your story.
Yeah.
And so I was saying to Josh, like very early on in working with the Unioverse, like I so wish that novelists had this opportunity to work with a creative team, because then they can see it takes a village. Like a story, the best stories aren't the work of a lone creative genius. That's so rare. Yeah. If it exists at all, really, if anyone's being honest about it. So for me as an editor, I've had to really adjust, like knowing who I'm working with, knowing how much pushback I'm likely to get, knowing how open they are to like, yes, I'm completely lost, save me here, versus like, oh, I just need you to look at my commas.
Yeah.
Light touch.
Yeah.
So adjusting in that space versus adjusting in this space has really expanded me creatively, which I appreciate.
Definitely. I know, this is like a strange, I think always like a taboo topic to talk about, but in many ways it's something that I think everybody faces in some shape or form throughout their lives, is either discouragement or conflict. And I think from a perspective of artists, in many ways that can be super demotivating when you suddenly have somebody criticizing your work or you criticizing somebody else's and that not being accepted. And I think finding that balance of being able to check your ego at the door, but also knowing what's right for you and knowing what's good for your career and your artistry is really important. And I think that's probably one of the hardest things to find. And I'm just trying to think in perspective of people that are going to be working together in our community, creating, right? Because like you said, great things aren't created alone. And if you have any advice on, sticking to your artistry and sticking to what you consider being good, what you consider being your art, right? But minding that ego. It's a loaded question.
I mean, Angie, you have books on this essentially, right? I mean, in a way.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Well, I've written a couple of books for authors who are in that search for agents and publication, and I do cover that need to let other people into your process. But I have a great story. That's actually my husband's story, Warren. When he wrote the book, it's called Tides of Mauritania, and it was published by HarperCollins, Harper Voyager, I think in like 2015. And when he his agent at the time was Richard Curtis, who has since retired, but there's a scene towards the end of the book that's very visceral, shall we say, very controversial. And his agent was like, I'm not really sure that we're going to want to go with this. It's pretty brutal. Like, can we dial it back? And Warren was very, very, very worried that, because in his mind, and he was right, the entire book was leading to this scene. There were breadcrumbs all the way through the book leading to this is the thing that is going to happen. And when you get there as the reader, you're like, of course, now I see, obviously this is what has to happen. But his agent was balking at it. And so he asked Warren to change it. And Warren was like, even if it meant that Warren said his choice was make the change and it's going to get published, don't make the change and maybe it won't get published. So he really had to think about it. So he goes back to his agent and he says, no, I'm not going to make the change. His agent goes, well, I really think you should think about it. Are you sure? So Warren went back and spent like another week just agonizing over this decision. And he stuck with his creative guns. And he says, I'm not going to make the change. And his agent said, yeah, I figured you wouldn't. And after all this agony that he'd gone through, like, do I remain true to the creative vision of this book? And it went on and sold, and it was fine.
And it's a badass ending, truly.
Yeah. It's very like, whoa.
Okay,
but the book would have been ruined if he had agreed to change that ending.
That's a really good example. I'm glad he did stick with it. Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah.
I think it is a fine line. It's really hard, I think, for people that are aspiring to whatever it may be, whether it's a writer, an artist, or, you want to be going to politics. It doesn't matter
applies to anything, really.
What the goal is, but it's hard to, because you do need to have a vision and an instinct that you need to follow. And you shouldn't let people stop you. But you should also be aware of what they're saying. They may be wrong, but they may be right. And that's where, I think it comes down to instinct. You have to be passionate, but you have to understand what constructive feedback is and what feedback, is blocking you. But,
Definitely.
I think it all comes down to the person and what you want to accomplish. But as tropey as it sounds, or as common as it is, anybody who wants to do something is going to do it regardless. Right. So,
yeah, but keeping your mind open, and not take, I think for me, it was always like, I used to be growing up, I'd always take everything so personally and just be so defensive and so stubborn. And I think that took me a long time to grow out of that. I think when I started to make music is when I did. And so finding that, which is ironic because you'd probably think that if when you do start creating, you're even more protective of it. And I do get, like, I think I get very sensitive, like many artists do, some don't. But I think this kind of brings us into a really good moment to ask you, what are your guys' secrets? And I think maybe you can think of it in a context of like, what's kept you almost, I don't think sane is the right word, but in control when it comes to creating and writing and, you know, staying true to yourselves as artists.
Man,
Getting deep.
That's a good question.
It is. I don't know if I'm going to answer it correctly.
You can take your time.
The way that I look at it is I have to, whether it's for Unio or through Hex Publishers or something that I don't know about, for me, I believe I'm a storyteller. You know, I have to tell stories. I don't know if that's a way of coping with like when the world is crazy and you need a distraction, but I love, you know, coming up with these ideas. So I have to eat and sleep it, you know, I process it all. Like that's just who you are. So I think that it's about understanding your passion and that's the secret. You have to be passionate about it. If it becomes a chore, then it's for me, it's dead. There's no point. Like I didn't need, you know, I have a multiple businesses that are very successful. I wasn't coming into that. I wasn't looking for this when Wyeth was like presented the idea for what this could be and the storytelling like possibilities and who we got to work with. I was like, oh my God, I want to see what happens by stepping into this fold. And I came onto it purely from passion, you know, and that's why I'm still here, because it's fun and I'm excited by it. So that, I guess that's my secret, right? Is to be excited by what you do. You know, you have to be passionate about it. So
that's a great one. Angie?
Wow. I think I'm the flip side of that. I need to have other places to go when something gets frustrating in one corner of my life. I need to have something else to do. And I do a lot of different things. So this is a big part of my life right now, and I'm enjoying it. I'm also studying to be a Pilates teacher. I also knit like a fiend. So I'm like knitting all the time. I love to read. I have lots of things that I'm constantly doing, and they all eventually present a frustration, and you're like, okay, I can walk away from that for a minute and go over here. The other thing I really need is accountability. And Josh is so good at managing me as far as like, you know, and I've had a couple of moments where I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know how I'm going to get all this done. You know, and he's like,
we've all have.
Yeah. And he's just so good at being like, Angie, it's going to be okay. Like, let's focus on the end. Let's focus on where this product is going to end up. And we're going to be so proud of it when it's done. And then when I can, you know, kind of get that vision, like, yes, okay. Yeah. Then I can he calms me down and I'm like, okay, I can focus on this. I have this time set aside to work just on this. I have deadlines. I am accountable to other people on this project. It's not just me working on it when I have the time to do it. Mm-hmm. So that accountability and schedule thing, you know, you would think that's kind of in conflict with creativity, but I think it was Stephen King who said, doesn't he like sit down and write? Like, this is a job for me. I set aside the time. I sit down. I work at my job. If you only work when inspiration strikes, you'll never work.